Today we're reviewing Intel's brand new Core i3-100, 111, 011, 10-100. Or, not in binary, the Intel i3-10100. We thought we'd get ahead of it a little bit and maybe help Intel with planning its next generation of naming, because this seems to be about the path they're on. So the i3-10100 is an interesting CPU because genuinely it's kind of taking the place of where the i7s used to be in terms of specs, but coming down significantly in price, down from 300 plus for what a 7700K once cost to about 140 bucks, what we paid for this one retail. And today we're going to be reviewing it and seeing how it compares versus Intel's previous i7s to see if it really is the one to take the place of those, and of course how it compares to the R3-3100 at about $100 in theory, and the 3300X at about $120 in theory. So let's get to it. Before that, this video is brought to you by EVGA's RTX 2060 KO. We previously reviewed the RTX 2060 KO model for its fused down RTX 2080 die that uniquely benefited Blender and some professional applications, offering better performance than expected in some pro workloads while offering usual strong RTX 2060 performance for gaming. The RTX 2060 KO also includes the game Deliver Us the Moon for free with EVGA GeForce RTX cards. EVGA is actively restocking its RTX 2060 KO with new dies, which you can find linked in the description below. So the i3-10100, it falls into the same category as the 10400, where it really, actually even more so, it really shouldn't be paired with a Z490 motherboard. Clearly, it's more of a B or an H combination, but those aren't out yet. So you're kind of forced to get a Z490 board right now, but ultimately, this CPU is meant to be sold for people buying lower end platforms, and that's fine. But Intel does it a bit differently right now than AMD, where Intel's lower end platforms historically, like you look at the 300 series for example, have not been able to increase the memory frequency beyond what the CPU officially supports. So that'd be, in this instance, 2666 megahertz, same as the 10400, whereas with our standardized test platform for everything, we run 32 because it works all the way back to the ages of the, well, take like Ryzen 1 for example, or Intel's then current parts, and all the way up to now, and it still kind of makes sense. But these CPUs, we need to run twice. We run once with our standardized kit of memory, so you get a like-for-like comparison across the stack, and then we run it once with a more realistic kit of memory for this CPU, because you're more likely to couple it with a platform that maxes out at 2666. We have a whole separate piece on this. We have a really in-depth dive on just a ton of memory configurations with all kinds of timings, all the way down to CL10. So we did CL10, we did 11, 13, 13, something else. We did CL15, CL14, and frequencies all the way up to 4,000 megahertz and all the way down to 2666. If you want to see those numbers, it's in our i5-10400 follow-up, but the same ideas apply here, where the CL15 kit at 2666 makes sense realistically for what you buy, and then if you spend an entire day tuning it, sure, you can get it a bit better, but it never quite makes up for the frequency loss coming down from 32 CL14. But there's a whole separate video on that. We'll defer you to that one if you have commentary or questions before posting them. As for the i3-10100, the primary points of note would be that it does have an IGP, so that's maybe valid or relevant. It does not have TVB or thermal velocity boost, so Intel's threshold at which you get an extra 100 megahertz on the higher end parts like the 10900K, that doesn't exist here. And then Turbo Boost 3.0 is also not on this part. So that does simplify things in terms of how boosting works. And for the rest, well, we could probably just get into the testing. So as always, testing methodology is linked in the description below. Let's start out with some frequency logs and then get through games and production benchmarks. We need to start by analyzing how the CPU is expected to behave, with a close eye on frequency in single-threaded and multi-threaded workloads. Remember that we tested with power limits and turbo duration periods strictly enforced to standardize reviews and make data comparison fair. This is something that we explained in a separate piece, although it has less bearing here than it does with the K-SKU parts, where you have a lot more range with things like TVB or Turbo 3.0, which are excluded from these lower end products. For Cinebench one thread, the Intel i3-10100 CPU runs mostly at a flat 4200 megahertz start to finish. That's a one-threaded load, and the CPU is not hitting Intel's advertised 4.3 gigahertz boost clock for this test. The CPU doesn't hit 4.3 in testing, but we did observe that it almost exclusively hits 4.3 when only running hardware info and nothing else. It is possible that 4.3 could happen without logging software running, although that seems unlikely given that none of the other CPUs have this issue and hardware info isn't a particularly heavy load. But either way, while software is active, we can't see if it's hitting 4.3 in this test, and so it seems to stick to about 4.2 gigahertz for the max single-threaded frequency. We'll look at average all-core frequency using Blender next. In this one, we've intentionally zoomed the chart to an obscene scale of 4,000 megahertz to 4,300 megahertz. That's necessary to see the tiny fluctuations in frequency, but obviously we'd prefer to have a chart that starts at 0. Then, though, it would just be a flat line. So this line is functionally perfectly flat and has basically 0 deviation from 4100 megahertz all-core. It's very stable, and sometimes that's a good thing. But this is where you can expect the performance for all-core workloads when at least PL1, PL2, and Tau are enforced as relevant. We'll start our gaming benchmarks with Total War, 3 Kingdoms, and the campaign test at 1080p. The Intel i3-10100 4-core 8-thread part, a verifiable i7 replacement, ends up at 111 FPS average and runs proportionally behind in 1% and 0.1% lows. In other words, we're not seeing any excursion from the mean of average to low delta in spite of the CPU's status as an i3, at least in name, even though it's an old i7 in spirit. Despite being similar to the 7700K in some ways, the 7700K stock CPU still leads the 10100 by 9.6% in average FPS and runs equivalent in low-end frame times. The 7700K OC allows it a jaunt to 126 FPS average. More importantly, this testing is with our standardized review memory, and based on what we know now, you won't be able to reach 3200 MHz without a Z490 motherboard. No one should pair the i3-10100 with a Z490 board. It really doesn't make sense. You should be buying a B or H motherboard at this price class, because then you're spending potentially significantly more money on your motherboard than the CPU. Finishing the comparisons at 3200 with our standardized kit, the i3-10100 would be about $20 over the expected price of the 3300X, which runs about equal to the 7700K when stock and allows it about a 10% lead over the 10100. Lows are functionally equivalent and are not appreciably different here. Ryzen isn't magically smoother, as some of the Reddit comments say, but it is overall superior in average frame rate in this title. As for the 2666 result that we think is more realistic because that's what you'll likely see on B or H motherboards, the 10100 loses about 10% of its performance and falls to 100 FPS average. That marks it as now about tied with an overclocked 3100 at $100, while the 3300X leads the 2666 result by 24%, with uneven RAM between the two of them. It's not even close at this point. The memory difference matters, and unlocking it is important. That's especially true when considering that 2666 is actually about the same price as 3000 MHz kits with similar timing, so you wouldn't even have to spend more money to get better memory, but you would need a platform that would allow it, and Ryzen's does, while the Intel H and B boards, historically at least, have not. Here's a Frametime plot to talk about the supposed smoothness of one part versus another. In reality, this shows a frame-by-frame replay that empirically represents and reinforces the performance in a real sense, in a play-by-play look at how the player will experience the frame output and the perception of how smooth that output is. Frame times are measured in milliseconds and represent the frame-to-frame interval, with lower being better, and prevent an abstraction from the base metric of time to a rate, which can hide things. The i3-10100 doesn't have any major excursions from frame n-1. We want to see frame-to-frame intervals under 8 to 12 milliseconds, which is around when it might become perceptible to an astute gamer. Performance is overall consistent. The 10100 here does fine. Plotting the 3300X, we see overall lower frame times, previously illustrated with the higher rate, but similar frame-to-frame characteristics. For a point of reference, the R3-3100 blows out the chart visibility and shows the more extreme end of frame-to-frame variability. A lot of this difference between the 3100 and the 3300X is moving from 2 CCXs to 1, where we now encounter split cache challenges and some additional CCX to CCX latency. It's not a bad experience, but it certainly is more noticeable and more variable. Let's break for one more frame time plot. This one looks at the 2666 result versus the 3200 result. The 2666 entry has several more deviations of 8 milliseconds or greater, while the 10100 with 3200 MHz memory is consistently lower in frame times. The 3300X, meanwhile, runs significantly below the 10100 at 2666. Hitman 2 is next, useful for its wide CPU scaling range. The 10100 starts at 102 FPS average with our standard review memory, with it lowest where we'd expect given its flanks of the 3100 OC and 7700K stock. The 10100 result here allows the stock 7700K a lead of 5.3% when stock to stock with standard memory, and the more realistic 2666 limit has the 7700K about 14.5% ahead. That means the 10100 is right next to the stock 1600AF here, which was $85 when we bought it, and that the 3100 stock result also holds a 6.3% lead over the 10100 result. Tested with the same speed memory, the 10100 really is a successor to the 7700 era i7 CPUs. Unfortunately, it's not a K SKU, so we still lose a lot of the benefit that the old i7 CPUs still have if they were K parts. But it's getting close. Intel gets credit for bringing its old i7 line down in price to about $140 for the i3, something that used to cost over $300. We'd like to see an unlocked B&H platform or a K SKU i3, but given that the pricing of the non-K SKU i3s is what it is, it's unlikely that the value would be justifiable. So unfortunately, it just doesn't seem realistic. F1 2019 is an interesting title for its higher scaling and frame rate, but at this level of performance, that's actually not that important. It matters more at the 10.9 or the 10600K level of performance. But the Intel i3 is distant enough from the top that we aren't worried about the GPU bottlenecks that we normally are. That isn't a slight against the part, it's just a reminder, and the same goes for the Ryzen 3 CPUs for the most part. The 10100 actually does really well with 3200 MHz memory here. If Intel ever unlocks its B&H platforms and CPUs fully, something like the 10100 might be very competitive. The 7700K at 5.1 GHz is a great stand-in representation of this. At 245 FPS average for the OC, the old 7700K is nearly keeping up with the new 10600K and is able to outmatch all of AMD's close-by offerings. Intel's i3 CPUs could be really good if unlocked and coupled with platforms that allow memory tuning as well. But given Intel's huge market of OEMs, it's perhaps unlikely to expect these changes to come anytime soon. Up next, F1 2019 at 1440p. We shouldn't typically see too much shuffling the stack from a resolution change when already relatively unlimited, but F1 does crush the numbers between RAM speed more than normally. The 10100 standardized result ran at 203 FPS average, while the 2666 result had it at 196 FPS average. The gap is only a maximum improvement of 3.9% here, with the load now shifted elsewhere, now that a higher graphics load is present. The 10100 ends up between the 3600 stock and 3100 OC. The 3300X and 3300X OC results are against the bottleneck, which seems to be lower on AMD hardware in this bench. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is next. The 10100 with our standardized test kit ran at 130 FPS average, with lows at 84 FPS and 75 FPS. That leads the 2666 result by 14% in average FPS, leaving the 2666 behind with the 3100 stock CPU. The 3100 with our standard memory and 10100 with 2666 RAM end up being functionally equivalent, while the 10100 with the standard test memory scales that same 14% over the AMD $100 part. As for the $120 3300X, even with the 10100 represented in its best light with the faster memory, the 3300X still leads. The 3300X ends up 4.5% ahead at 136 FPS average, with lows equivalent and within variant. The 7700K stock result runs at 138 average, leading the 3300X and the 10100 alike, with an overclock boosting it significantly to 149. GTA 5 isn't as harsh on the 10100 from a memory standpoint. The 10100 stock CPU with our standardized memory runs at 97 FPS average, leading the 2666 result by only 7% here. We see about 14% scaling elsewhere, similar to the scaling we saw in the 10400 results, but that delta shrinks in this older game. Both 10100 results end up between the 3100 results, with the 2666 benchmark about equal to the 3100 with our standard memory. And the 10100 at 97 FPS average leads the 89 FPS average of the 3100 by a somewhat meaningful amount, but not one that you'll really notice in gameplay. It's more of one that'll show up in measurements. The 3300X, meanwhile, runs about 104 FPS average stock. So the results here are all pretty close together, and it's an older title with a focus more on higher frequency, so that lack of a gap between them isn't too surprising. Red Dead Redemption 2 is up next, this chart at 1080p medium. The 10100 standardized test result has it at 105 FPS average, with lows proportional to what we see on the 3100 and 3300X CPUs. The 3300X stock and OC results end up against the lower ceiling for AMD CPUs here, where our GPU bottleneck is encountered sooner for those parts. We still need to get the higher end R5 and R7 CPUs rerun through Red Dead 2 for medium, but for now, the price neighbors are at least present. Despite being a new version of the 7700K, the actual 7700K's higher frequency is allowing it a performance lead over the 10100, stock over stock anyway, amounting to 14% versus the 10100 with the 3200 MHz memory settings. Total War's Battle benchmark, meanwhile, has the 10100 standardized result at 119 FPS average with a 2666 result at 108 FPS average. That has the 3100 OC result between the two entries from Intel's new i3. The 1600 AF, meanwhile, is just ahead of both, although it's basically unavailable now. And the 3300X is leading, stock to stock, by 8.4% against the same memory spec 10100 result, or 19% ahead of the 2666 variant. Blender starts off our production benchmarks with the i3-10100 rendering our GN logo test file in 39.5 minutes with the standard 3200 MHz bench memory, and 39.6 minutes with the slower 2666 memory. This is the same behavior we saw in the i5-10400 benchmarking. Blender just doesn't care much about memory speed with these workloads. AMD's offerings, meanwhile, have a small but significant lead. The 3100 completed the render in 35.9 minutes, so 9.1% less time than the i3, and the 3300X completed in 31.4 minutes, or 21% less time. The unlocked R3s also improved slightly beyond these numbers with all-core overclocks applied. There was a time not long ago when AMD's advantage was solely in core count, and a comparison between two 4-core 8-thread parts would have been a victory for Intel. Intel's own 3-year-old 7700K beat the i3 by 10.4% stock and 21.5% with the 5.1 GHz overclock. But as for the i3-10100 versus the modern AMD Ryzen 3 parts, it's not just a core count advantage that AMD has anymore. V-Ray is another render benchmark, but one that cares a bit more about memory, at least in this testing. The baseline average with our usual memory kit was 6274K samples, while switching to slower memory, more typical of the platform, lowered that score to 6133K samples on average. That difference may sound larger than it is when expressed as points. The faster memory kit only scored 2.3% higher. The 3100 at 6582K samples averaged only 4.9% ahead of the i3 in this particular test. That's a more favorable result for Intel's chip than seen in the Blender benchmark, but obviously the 3100 is still ahead. The 3100's divided cache may have been a particular disadvantage with V-Ray, as the 3300X's score is significantly higher at 7666K samples average, or 22.2% ahead of the i3. Intel's older 7700K surrounds the 3300X's stock and OC scores with its own, a lower score of 7420K samples stock for that, and a higher score of 8293K samples overclocked. That positions the 7700K's best results as 32.2% ahead of the i3, even with 3200 MHz memory. Each of our Adobe Premiere benchmarks involves rendering one of our own past videos with the same settings that we use internally for publication on YouTube. The 1080p clip finished in 6.9 minutes with the 10100 using 3200 memory, and took a little bit longer with 2666, completing in 7.3 minutes. This is the smaller of the two Premiere workloads that we run, so most CPUs end up within a few minutes of each other overall. The 3100 was just seconds faster at 6.5 minutes, and the overclocked 3100 and stock 3300X tied at 5.9. Judging how these results will scale with larger workloads or multiple projects is a matter of percentages, though. 5.9 minutes is 14.5% faster than 6.9 minutes, and if you're rendering videos all day, that would start to matter. The old 7700K barely did any better than the 10100 here with a stock render time of 6.7 minutes, but a major advantage was given to the 7700K and the Ryzen CPUs when they are overclocked. At 5.1 GHz, the 7700K tied the 3300X overclocked CPU when it was at 4.4 GHz with a completion time of 5.7 minutes. The Premiere 4K B-roll render benchmark takes longer to complete and therefore gives a better picture of why differences of less than a minute in the 1080p test are still significant. Here, the 10100 took 22 minutes to render with 3200 MHz memory and 23 with the 2666 MHz memory. More significantly, the 3100 completed this project in 20.7 minutes stock and 18.6 overclocked. The 3300X nearly ties this overclocked result at its stock frequency and pushed to an even faster 18-minute render time with its own overclock. That's 4 to 5 minutes of real time saved versus the 10100, depending on the memory used, or 18 to 22% faster. As with the 1080p render, the overclocked 7700K is almost exactly tied with the overclocked 3300X. The 7-zip benchmark is comprised of two parts, compression and decompression. The compression half has proven more reactive to changes in memory speed, and the 10100 improved by 5.9% from 30,000 MIPS using 2666 to 31.8 thousand MIPS using the 3200 MHz memory. In contrast to the V-Ray and Premiere benchmarks, the stock 3100 stomps the 10100 here, with an improvement of 12.5%, up to 35,759 MIPS. Overclocking the 3100 put it between the 3300X's stock and OC scores of 40,441 MIPS and 41,108 MIPS, respectively, for those two. The higher of these is 29.3% ahead of the 10100 with the usual benchmarking memory, and the i7-7700K OC, meanwhile, just matched the 3300X's stock result. So this isn't a test where Intel is excelling at present. The decompression benchmark behaves a bit differently, with barely any scaling whatsoever from the faster memory. Still, the AMD CPUs remain firmly in the lead, significantly more so in the case of the 3100, with a stock score 21.7% ahead of the 10100 score. The overclocked 3300X leads by a similar percentage margin to the compression test at 51,470 MIPS, and then the 7700K again underperforms relative to the previous tests, maxing out at an overclocked score of 46,069 MIPS. Still, that's a significant lead over a CPU multiple generations newer, and it's still ahead of the i3 even without an overclock. Power testing's last. We use these same modified GN logo render files that we do for thermal and frequency testing. After waiting 5 minutes to ensure short-term turbo limits have expired on CPUs where it's relevant, we take power consumption directly from the cables. The 10100 was consuming 51.6 watts at this point, which we know from earlier testing is maintaining an all-core frequency of 4100 megahertz across the entire CPU. This is one area of significant improvement over the 7700K, even if it does come at the cost of performance. The older CPU was consuming 78 watts at this same point, and a massive 124 watts when overclocked. The 3100 ties the 10100 at 50.4 watts, while the 3100 OC, 3300X, and 3300X OC all tied at 71 watts. Disallowing overclocking does make for an efficient chip. Testing with Cinebench's R20 all-core benchmark resulted in a similar power draw of about 47 watts, so turbo duration isn't a factor to consider really with a 10100. This is a CPU without TBB or Turbo Boost 3.0, where the all-core frequency drops almost immediately to 4.1 and stays there. AMD's CPUs are similarly close to the same power draw as in the previous Blender test. So that's the i3-10100 review, and that also means that we're mostly at the end of what Intel has released thus far. There are some more non-K parts that we haven't looked at yet, and depending on, well, if it seems like they'll be interesting, we may or may not look at them. But we've now looked at the i5-10600K, 10.7, the 10.9, the 10.4, and the 10.3. Sorry, the 10.1. These names are terrible. The 10.3 we haven't looked at yet. So there's also, I didn't mention this, there's a 10.300 and a 10.320. And those two CPUs do have an extra 2 megabytes of cache. So that could be an interesting look from a testing perspective. But other than that, you're mostly talking about a 100 megahertz difference from one CPU to the next in the i3 family, while the price range is pretty wide. So at $140, the i3-10100 is just, it's really hard to find a reason to buy this CPU. We tried to look at it, and the best excuse we could come up with is you want specifically this level of performance, like 4-core, 8-thread part, except you need an IGP. That's kind of where it falls. So, and if you're that person, please let us know what your use case is. But for the most part, people spending in this category, at least in the enthusiast audience, and maybe it changes once you go to mainstream a bit, but in this audience, when you're spending $140 on your CPU, you're probably buying a DGPU with it, because otherwise you're going to be bound. You're not playing games with the IGP in nearly all instances, and a reasonably expensive CPU. It's not the most expensive you get, but it's reasonably expensive. So we just can't really find a reason to buy the 10100 explicitly right now. It is behind AMD's, in theory, cheaper parts. But that's the other thing, too, to discuss is the R3 3300X, 3100. at least today as of filming, they're not out there. You can't buy them. And Intel's is. So it's hard for us to say exactly what AMD's pricing will land at, but it typically is pretty close. It just might have a settling period. If we assume that everyone has their CPUs priced at where they say they're going to be priced, then the 10100 is not really a defensible purchase from our testing. And maybe you have a different use case you could share with us so we can explore it. But it just makes more sense to us to buy a 3300X. It's cheaper. It does better in all these tests. And that's really all there is to it. So not a great showing. It is kind of an i7 follow-up. But we really want to see these parts unlocked fully. The problem, though, is when Intel adds that K suffix to it, it also adds a lot to the price. And like with the 7350K, you really don't want to be spending $160, $180 for an i3 part just because it's unlocked. It needs to be this price, except unlocked. So if they did that, this might be a different conclusion. But that's not what they did. And we can't review based on what they could have done. So that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. As always, subscribe for more. You can go to store.gamersnexus.net to help us out directly, or patreon.com/gamersnexus. And I'm going to go to sleep now. So we'll see you all next time.